Chag Sameach, happy Passover to everyone who's celebrating tonight, and even those who aren't. I wanted to share a very personal story of a Seder that 10 years ago came into my life and shifted the way I viewed Passover, how I viewed friendships, and how I viewed the people who have come before me in the world of comedy. Tonight, I dedicate my Seder to Sid Caesar and to many of the people I'm about to speak about in the story. For many of them, we have lost. Thankfully, Mel Brooks is still here. And so I invite you to take the next few minutes to sit back and in honor of Passover, join me in sharing this story with you. There's a little bit of sort of cantorial stuff in the beginning and the end, so hopefully you don't mind that, but it goes right into the story. So during the Passover Seder, we speak of four sons, or four children, as we've come to know them in the modern day: the wicked, the wise, the simple, and the one who does not even know how to ask a question. I want to take you on a journey now of a time when my Jewish roots, which are buried so deep in the New York Catskills, when they were intertwined with roots of the same ilk. An evening when that child who recently understood the power of asking a question mustered up the courage and overcame her fears to ask four. A tale of what leaving Egypt awarded the Jewish people in the end. A tale of how comedy is rooted in the soil of Judaism. Before I begin, I want to clarify why I'm telling the following story. It's an intimate look into a Passover Seder that I had the honor of being a guest at 10 years ago this week. And the intention is not to brag or boast about who I shared charoset with, but to allow you inside the crazy world I live in and to share with you my deepest respect for the fathers and mothers of American comedy. I also know that within the next decade or so, the name Sid Caesar won't ring many bells, excite, or lift an eyebrow. So I want to continue to say his name and share his tales before his memory is faded. And the purpose is also to remind us the power of lasting friendships and the struggles we all face when they're coming to an end. I want to note that many of the people in this story have passed away, so tonight at my own Seder, I dedicate it to the memory of Sid Caesar and the memory of all the people that we've lost. For when we remember them, they are sitting beside us. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh? Why is this night different from all other nights? These are the infamous words spoken at every Jewish Seder by the youngest person at the table. By the time a Jewish child is asking for solid food, they are also being told to recite this Jewish prayer. As the youngest of three, I knew these questions by heart. I asked them every year at the big Passover Seder, just south of the Catskills in New York. Now, most kids end their illustrious four-question run about 10 or 11 when some snarky cousin takes over, but I'm pretty sure I held on to my solo for a good 13 years. So you can imagine my surprise when I was asked to reprise my role as the question asker in my early 30s, but this time in Beverly Hills, surrounded by comics who also immigrated from the stages of the Catskills. Let me take you back to the year before, in 2012, when I was brought to the great Sid Caesar's home to meet him after his caretakers, Lou and friend Zygmunt, had seen me in a show in LA called When You're in Love, the Whole World is Jewish. I'd always been a huge fan of Sid's, and they offered to introduce me to him. Now, when I walked into his home, he was laying in a hospital bed, barely coherent, as Arthur Hiller sat beside him trying to remind him of their friendship. Arthur directed Love Story and Man of La Mancha, to name a few. And then Lou said, "Sid, this is Rena Strober. She's a singer." And his bushy eyebrows lifted, his eyes opened, and he said, "Oh, wow." Lou then said, "Rena, sing something." And suddenly I was singing. "There's a somebody I'm longing to see. I hope that he turns out to be." And all of a sudden, Sid came to and began singing along. "Someone who'll watch over me." Now, to make a 365-day story much shorter, I began going up to Sid's house every week, sitting at his bedside and singing to him. And the more I sang, the more he remembered. He shared stories of his writer's room, his hanging Mel Brooks out of a window in Chicago, Florence, his love, his dog Carlin, and he always gave me advice, like, Rena, write what you know. He always told me that. So fast forward 6 months later, and it was Passover. Lou and Fran had been having a second night Passover Seder for years. Theodore Bickel leads it, and Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner are known for their witty banter during dinner. Can you even imagine? And this year, they needed someone under 70 to ask the questions. And I was just the person. Theo Bickel had just played my father in the Fiddler on the Roof tour for a week, so I was really excited to get to spend more time with him. Now, before we get to the Seder, I just want to review the 4 questions for anyone who might need a refresher. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot, mikol halaylot, shebechol halaylot. You remember now? Theo Bickel was a traditional Jewish Seder leader, but this room was full of creative minds, which inspired me to rewrite the tune of the 4 questions. The most Jewish prayers can be sung to almost any tune, and if you've never tried this will make your next car ride very interesting. I decided to do the 4 questions to Real Live Girl, the song Sid sang in his Broadway show Little Me, and the last 2 to If I Were a Rich Man from Fiddler in honor of Theo. I'd originally planned on doing the 4th one to Springtime for Hitler, but Mel Brooks was late and I didn't want to offend anyone who may not have known what I was doing. I walked into Sid's warm and dated Beverly Hills home just before 6 p.m. with my heart racing and my prayer tucked tightly in my pocket. And the house smelled of brisket and mold and Shalimar. And the 50-year-old orange and brown living room carpet was covered with 4 long folding tables. And each table was lined with a mix of oversized dining room chairs and silver folding chairs. White tablecloths covered the tables and hung unevenly to the ground. And there were about 30 seats altogether. The walls of the room were lined with paintings, ranging from ones Sid found at art fairs to ones painted by his friends. And the glass display cabinets lined the back walls. With them filled awards Sid was given throughout his 70-year career. The fireplace mantel had photos that felt like they were out of a magazine, along with 2 urns. One had Sid's beloved dog Carlin, and the other Sid's wife Florence, who had always been such a big part of that home. And if you've ever played that game, if you could have dinner with 5 people, who would it be? I was currently living my choices. Before the start of the Seder, I was mingling with Sid's friends. Stell Harris and her husband had just seen my show, so we had lots to talk about, as well as John Biner and Norm Crosby, who had made cameos in the show. And for those of you who don't know, when You're in Love, the Whole World is Jewish, we would have celebrity guests for the reading of the will scene. It's like Jewish sketch comedy. I was asked to sit to the left of Theo because I was symbolically the child at the Seder. Yeah, I was the youngest by about 40 years. To my left was the incredible Lainey Kazan, and across from me was the beautiful Connie Stevens. To my right was Theo, and to his right was Sid. He was dressed in a suave black suit, and he looked wonderful. To his right was a chair for Mel Brooks, or shall I say, Elijah. Melijah. That is when I began to pinch myself. Or more honestly, I began to drink the Concord Great Manischewitz wine because I had no idea how I got here. Not only am I surrounded by my comic mentors, but I love Passover and this Jewish traditional dinner. If there is a Jewish form of heaven, this was it. Theo opened a very large, hard-covered Haggadah from 1940 and began the ceremony. He was serious and deeply spiritual. He spoke of the Jews being slaves in our past and in our present. He spoke of the Seder plate and the reason there was an orange on it. Now, at first, as a New Yorker, I thought this was a California Jewish tradition, but Theo explained, a religious man was once overheard saying that women, gays, and lesbians have as much of a place on the synagogue's bima as an orange has on the Seder plate. And so there it was, a beautiful California orange. I love this tradition and one I still use today. I'm starting to get nervous because the 4 questions are only 10 pages in. I put a few drops of Rescue Remedy on my tongue. It's a homeopathic remedy for nerves. I down a glass of wine and I prepare myself for the big moment. The 4 questions had never carried such pressure before. It is customary to have a child at the Seder to ask why we do the things we do, Theo addressed the crowd. I was the child. And so I stood and began. I've had the honor of spending time with Sid over the past few months, and he loves singing Real Live Girl from his Broadway show Little Me. I wanted to pay tribute to him and to Theo by altering the tune of the 4 questions. The beautiful thing about Jewish prayers is that no matter the tune, the meaning remains the same. And I begin, and my voice is quivering and my paper shaking in my hand. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot, shebechol halelot anu ochlim chametz umatzah, halayla hazeh kulo matzah. שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים שהירקות, הלילה הזה מורור. שבכל הלילות אין אנו מטבילים אפילו פעם אחד, הלילה הזה 2 פעמים. שבכל הלילות אנו אוכלים בין יושבין ובין מצובים, הלילה הזה כולנו מצובים. As I finish the 4 questions, the room fills with applause. At a Seder, at Sid Caesar's house. My tush is red from all the pinching I've been doing at this point, trying to convince myself that this was not a dream. I sit back down and finish another cup of Concord grape wine. And despite the Passover rule of drinking 4 cups of wine, I double down. Lainey grabs my hand and leans over and whispers, "That was really beautiful and special, Rena. Thank you for that." And I look around, and instead of people finding the humor in what I had done, they were moved and touched. I thought I'd get laughs, but instead I got emotional smiles and thank yous from across the room. It was then that I realized why this night is different from all other nights. Here is a room of incredible comics and entertainers, but they were here to honor their 90-year-old friend Sid, who sat at the head of the table in a wheelchair. And I began to sense an acknowledged mortality. When Mel Brooks finally arrived, he sat down next to Sid, and he took his hand in his and he kissed it. I saw in his eyes a deep love and an even deeper sadness. They were seeing their friend lose his spark, his energy. It was a palpable feeling. But Mr. Brooks smiled that smile, and he sat back in his chair and he told Theo, "Move it along." It's my kind of man. Towards the end of the first part of the Seder, Theo handed me the afikoman and said, "I'll be offering you 25 cents for it later." Yeah, this was an older crowd. Told him I was union and I couldn't take less than 50 cents. And the Seder continued. Theo turned a page and addressed the crowd. "Why do we eat matzah on this night?" And Mel Brooks shouts, "Because we're hungry." By this time, Theo had been chanting and teaching for 45 minutes, and the folks were getting restless. Okay, we're almost done with the first half of the Seder, but don't forget that after dinner we have more and more singing. And everyone jumped up out of their stiff chairs and headed for the buffet in the kitchen. And the smell of the delivery from Brent's Deli wafted through the entire home. And at this point, I decided to visit my friend Eddie Friedfeld, one of Sid's biographers, who was with Jeff Ross at another folding table. And we're all friars, and we used to hang out in New York at the Friars Club. And I listened to stories from Artie Butler and reminisced with Arthur Hiller, and I met Monty Hall, who did the most beautiful Shehechianu at the beginning of the night. I found my way back to the main table, and I sat next to Sid, and I kissed his cheek. And he smiled that smile, and he looked at me the way he does when I sing, with love. I'd promised him I'd bring him halva, so we shared the delicious Jewish treat and with smiles on our faces. And it was time for me to speak to Mel Brooks. I walked up to him and I said, "Mr. Brooks, you missed my 4 questions." And he responded with, "I hear you've been spending time with Sid. How did this happen?" And I explained how Lou and Fran had seen my show and introduced me. And I continued to tell him how Sid and I sing every week. And he turned to me and he placed his hands on my head. And he said, "Thank you for doing this. It means a lot." I was getting a blessing from Mel Brooks. He wasn't joking or even smiling. He looked straight into my eyes. And then he kissed me on the forehead. This was more meaningful than any blessing I'd gotten at my bat mitzvah from the rabbi, and I swore I would never wash my forehead after that night. After an hour of brisket and turkey and gefilte fish and chocolate-covered matzah, we sat back down for the second half of the Seder. Theo sang beautiful Yiddish versions of the Passover songs. We finished our wine, and then the Seder came to an end. By this time, it was close to 10 o'clock. A 4-hour Seder is epic for 30-year-olds and let alone octogenarians. I sat beside Sid again and he started to sing to me. I love you as much as I am able, considering I'm wealthy, considering you're poor. Another song from Little Me. And then Jeff Ross sat beside me and he marveled at how the music was bringing him back to life. And I loved witnessing this passing down of comedy from generation to generation. Not just comedy, but Jewish tradition and friendship. His friends began to say their goodbyes. Mel kissed him again. Connie reminded him that they had done Grease 2 together. Rabbi Jerry Cutler made us all laugh. Estelle Harris smiled. Lainey asked her my phone number. Eileen and Ben Graff hugged me warmly, and most touching, Sid's daughter Karen thanked me. You've made my father so happy, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for spending time with him. So why is this night different from all others? This night has reminded me that life is fleeting, that friends are insanely valuable, that Seders are long, and that Sid Caesar has touched so many lives. And I'm grateful to have been a part of an event and part of his life. Now, the following year, we had lost Sid in February, so when Passover came around, it was a really sad time for all of us who had celebrated that previous year. However, Lou and Fran decided it was a perfect reason for everyone to come together and raise a glass or 4 of Manischewitz to Sid and to tradition. Now, most of the faces were the same, but Theo was out of the country, so I was asked to take the wheel and lead it with Eddie Friedfeld. And there on the infamous mantle, on the brick fireplace, where Carlin and Florence had spent their time, now sat a 3rd urn. This one hadn't yet been taken out of the cardboard box, as it was fresh. But it was Sid, and he was still very much a part of that evening. Now, tonight at our tables, there's no Sid or Carl, but there's us. And we all have history, and we all have some pretty great jokes in our pocket. And we've all been slaves in Israel, and we've been slaves to ourselves. Our inner voices, our insecurities, our fears have governed our actions and inactions. Perhaps kings live within us, and perhaps this Passover we can free ourselves, even if for a moment. Sid Caesar faced many challenges throughout his life, but he persevered and gave the world what we needed most after World War II, laughter. And Mel Brooks made a career out of making people laugh at Hitler, because as he told me that night, if we laugh at him, we win in the end. And even Theo, who didn't set out to make us laugh, but instead connect us to folk music that brought our country together. These artists were my minion for an evening, but not just any evening, a Passover Seder, where my questions were not only asked, but were answered tenfold. So tonight, I celebrate the fact that we are still able to come together every year, as long as we are able. So let's turn back to the 4 children, the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one that cannot even ask a question. As the girl who learned just how important it is to ask a question, more questions to Sid over the course of my year-long friendship with him, and questions to myself, I ask you today, tonight, as you sit with your family and friends at a Seder, what child is within you? Which voice is speaking the loudest? I offer that we are all 4 children at all times. We are all wicked at times. We've been simple, we've used wisdom, and we have lost our ability to ask a question. But in honor of my personal tale, I hope that we sit amongst friends, both old and new, and we understand the meaning of asking questions. For it is in those questions that the deepest friendships are formed. Chag Sameach from my family to yours.